Thank you so much, Leah, Anne, and Liz, for including me. This has been an absolutely fascinating day, and I'm very pleased to briefly introduce Geoffrey Nunberg, who is a linguist and on the faculty at the UC Berkeley School of Information. And I will just name his most recent book, The Ascent of A-Word, Assholism. Did I get the stress right? The first 60 years, only 60.
That's all that's been around.
So, eager to hear what you have to say.
Not about that. Thank you very much. I have to say that if the task of being asked to take notes and do the reportage of a conference on taking notes weren't sufficient to make one self-conscious about the process, I lost my glasses on the airplane flying to London last week and went into one of those instant spectacles places. And they said, we can't do the graduated progressive lenses in overnight, but we can give you 2 sets of glasses and just change them every time the object of your vision, your gaze is within 30 inches. So I'm taking notes and going back and forth, and I'll be doing that here too. This was so varied and interesting and rich an experience that one feels absolutely liberated of any obligation to try to summarize what happened. And what I'm going to do is just give some random observations. I hope some of which will be locally interesting, but you should think there's a story about the Scotsman who comes into a bookseller in Edinburgh in the 18th century and sees a copy of Johnson's dictionary lying on a table, and he's leafing through it, and then he says to the bookseller, he says, "Yon book is half interesting, but frightfully disconnected." So that's sort of the tone I'm going to give you here. One observation I wanted to make, this was kind of random, was somebody mentioned Hansard's this morning. And as it happened, my wife and I were in London last week, and a friend of hers from the University of Texas originally is now working for Hansard's, for the House of Lords, and took us up to the Strangers Gallery, as it's called, to witness the question time in the House of Lords. And he sat us in these narrow benches up top, and then said, "Well, I have to go now and do my transcription," which is what he does. And I was surprised because he had told us that for the last 5 or 6 years they no longer transcribe the way, well, now they were doing it on machines, but the way Dickens did. And now they just tape it, and then people offline transcribe it at their leisure. I say, "Well, why do you have to be there?" He says, "Oh, well, you still need someone there because there might be an interruption, and if the interruption is answered by the speaker, you have to include it. If it isn't, you don't, and people may talk at the same time, and it would be absolutely impossible to do if you didn't have somebody there taking notes on what's going on to be combined with the transcription by the transcriber offline." And I thought, I learned something interesting about podcasts from that. As a linguist, I want to start with what to my mind was really the central question that arose in the first discussion session this morning is, what are we talking about? When we're talking about notes, what do we mean? And people were trying to figure this out. I copied down the definition of note in the relevant sense, not the musical note or struck an interesting note, in Merriam-Webster's, I guess it's the 12th or 13th collegiate where we're up to. And basically the relevance, they say, well, a memorandum or a condensed or informal record, a brief comment or explanation, a printed comment or reference set apart from the text, and some of these aren't relevant, a short informal letter. There are 2 schools of lexicography, of dictionary making, the splitters and the lumpers. And this is kind of a lumper approach that throws together a lot of different things. And you say, well, what makes something a note? What about a mash note? Why is that a note? Or why is a doctor's note a note? I picked these because they're not uses of note that you'd translate, say, into French or Italian using the cognate note. You wouldn't say, I need a note from the doctor in French. A condolence note, a suicide note. And of course, in French, you'd use note for a bill or a grade in a class or something in a way that you wouldn't in English. So what are we talking about here? And people had various ideas in the morning session. Informal and brief were two a brief comment or explanation, short informal letter. Those seem to be two properties that people often associate with notes. Private was a term that came up, and we were discussing what was discussed this morning, private or public, and what do we mean by private and what do we mean by public, particularly in a world in which the boundary between those two categories is being effaced. Tiffany this morning spoke of notes as having two senses, of snatched fragment or something worthy of attention, and that's still inherent, I think, in a lot of the ways the word is used. Should we think of a note as something derivative? The definition of brief comment or explanation implies that it's a comment on something or an explanation of something, but that a note is subordinate to often to some other text or discourse. Is a note necessarily instrumental? Liz Cohen said this morning, I think I got this right, but I'm not as good at this, our friend at Hansard at transcribing. Notes are and we should have had 2 or 3 people doing it. Notes are the tracks we leave in the sand as we head on our trail of discovery, something like that. But the idea is that notes are a stage in a process to doing something else, and that's very often the case, the notes you prepare to write a novel or a textbook, the notes you make for yourself before a class lecture, and so on. Are notes in that sense generally provisional or transitional stage? Usually when you publish your notes, it's as if notes on such and such is as if you have in mind to make a more comprehensive, compendious work at some later stage. One way of thinking of this kind of word when you see this, people will often invoke the Wittgensteinian idea of a family resemblance, as the resemblance between various portraits, each of which resembles the one next to it, but say the endpoints don't resemble each other. And the trouble with that, linguists really are rarely happy with that, because the trouble is it doesn't tell you how to deal with the endpoints. So there's you're a little kid, you're playing with a big ball, and you see a small rubber ball, and you see the family resemblance there, and then you see a baseball, and say, oh, I see, it doesn't have to be soft, it can be hard, and then you see a bowling ball, and it can have holes in it, and you see a football, and it doesn't have to be round, it can be oblong. But you really don't know what the word means until you come to a hockey puck. And at that point, you realize, oh, I see, ball stops here. So an interesting question is, what isn't note? What isn't a note? It's interesting. A blog post we don't generally think of as notes. They are short, they're brief, they're informal, they're observations very often about something. What is it that disinclines us to use the word note when we're talking about blog posts? I was thinking about SMS and text messages. It used to be that kids passed pieces of paper under the desk in algebra class to one another. Those were notes, right? And if you got caught, the teacher would read the note. Would you like to share that with you? Now that's done electronically with SMS, texting to each other. And people are all complaining that somehow this is going to be the death of English, that the kids have changed from using one medium to another in the way they communicate with each other in class. But what's interesting is I don't think you would call those SMS messages notes. Is that because electronic communication is kind of resistant to the idea of notes? No, you'd say, I had an email the other day, I had a note from Leah who said blah, 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 and that's a perfectly reasonable way to use notes of an electronic communication. Is it that the paper note is somehow more seditious than the electronic communication, that it is private in a way that it's not a public act in the way that handing a material document across? I don't have an answer to this. I think those are the kinds of questions you might want to ask if you're looking for the general notion of what a note is. People talked about pasquinades or pasquinate, however you want to think of it, in French or Italian. I don't think those are notes either. I don't think the things affixed to the statue of Pasquino, the statue in the Piazza Pasquino, it's not of Pasquino, are notes in any real sense of the term. I don't think tweets are notes. Maybe because they're not instrumental, because they're not used to, in the process of doing anything else, they just are by themselves. So I think an interesting line of inquiry would say, well, what are not notes? Where do notes end? And that might be an interesting way of getting at what they are. I was thinking also about books. Peter Burke spoke of this morning, books assembled from notes. And of course, if you're a linguist, this is an important point because the foundational text of modern linguistics, still for many people, although less so perhaps than when I was a graduate student, is Saussure's Cours de linguistique générale, which was assembled by two former students, one of whom had sat in the core classes and one of whom hadn't, from the notes taken by various of his students over a period of 4 or 5 years and put together. And the interesting thing is that when you open the cours, and I hadn't done this in a long time, and actually went and opened it, of course it was written from notes. You can tell instantly there are 3 tasks of linguistics. The first task is this, that you can see that somebody was just transcribing his notes. There was a lot of controversy at the time about the process among linguists, whether they had captured Saussure's intentions, and it's bizarre that today there are linguists of a certain ilk sitting around trying to figure out what Saussure meant, and if we could only know what he meant by this long and parole and so on, we would have the answer to all questions about language. And we had no idea what he meant. It's just these notes. In 1959, I think, or 1960, another set of notes from those courses turned up, but they were written in a shorthand that nobody could read. And Rudolf Engler, who was the editor of Saussure, actually made this enormous effort to get behind that shorthand. He put notices in the Geneva newspapers and so on and so forth. And finally, because there were in the 19th century as there were in the 16th century, as we learned from a talk this morning, lots and lots of these systems of shorthand that not many people knew. And he finally found in the library, the Swiss National Library in Bern, a handbook to this obscure form of shorthand, and was able to decipher them. What that led me to think about was works compiled from notes in general. There are certain works that you think of in that way. Pascal, the Pensée, for example, is a work that was compiled also posthumously from notes. Nietzsche certainly reads like that, as a work transcribed from notes. And anything in Wikipedia reads as nothing but a work transcribed from notes. There's no coherent unity to it. But the genre that best fits this, and this again was mentioned this morning, is the dictionary. The dictionary, Alvin Kernan, in a book on Johnson, had 2 titles, and I can't remember either of them. The first title was very clumsy, so they changed it to another one. He wrote, Johnson's dictionary was a typical achievement of print, a language book made out of still other books that would determine the language of books yet to be written. In effect, what Johnson was doing was taking these books, excerpting passages, and Johnson was not somebody to whom you wanted to lend a book if you had any interest in reading it again, because he was going to hold it that way and underline and circle passages. We think of the dictionary now, or modern historians of lexicography tend to think of Johnson's dictionary now as in this lexicographical tradition that begins with Caudry's Table Alphabetical of 1604, and it's basically a word book. But it's been argued, Robert Di Maria made this argument, I think very persuasively, that that's not the right tradition. Johnson really thought of it much more in the tradition of a commonplace book, and that in fact he selected the citations and authors with that in mind. Alan Reddick, who I think was here at the time, wrote a very nice book on the 4th edition of Johnson's dictionary, from which, in 1775, I think, from which he expunged various citations by deist authors and others of suspicious theological affiliations. So it really isn't until the 19th century, and Peter Burke mentioned that we really get the dictionary as a word book. And with that comes a shift in the mode of note-taking, where Johnson was underlining passages in books and copying them directly into his dictionary. By the time of the OED, that James Murray is preparing the OED, it's all being transacted via slips. Peter Burke mentioned 100,000 slips. That actually was the estimate by Herbert Coleridge, one of the progenitors of the OED, of how many slips, how many citations it would take to do the project. In the event, the total was about 3.5 million, of which well over 1.5 million had already been collected when the first fascicle was published in 1888. And Murray sat in this shed in the back of his house, in the garden of his house in Oxford, with his sons assembling these slips, and as Peter said, pigeonholes and various other schemes of storage, lots of them dropping on the floor. Of the 3.5 million, more than 1 million were used actually in the OED. One point I just wanted to mention, because who was it this morning? I think Lisa Gittleman mentioned the self-referentiality of dictionaries, and this is an aside, but there is, to my knowledge, only one word in the original OED, the earlier edition, that is not illustrated by citations taken from slips. That's the word anglicity, which is defined as English quality as of speech or style, English idiom. Well, at the time that the OED appeared, that word had appeared only once, and that was in fact in James Murray's general explanation, the introduction to the OED himself, that he wrote himself, where he spoke of a central nucleus or central mass of many thousand words whose anglicity is unquestioned, he had in quotes. So it's in as much as he was citing himself, he didn't put a citation there. In a later edition, they found an earlier citation and then put citations down there for the word. So the process of compilation of these notes and then rendering them into a form in which they could be used was taken as far as it could be by the OED, which was the great enterprise of Victorian scholarship. To go beyond it, to go beyond 3.5 million citations, you would need to find another way of doing it. Well, I can now pull down 1 million citations for the word dictionary in 3 minutes. 3.5 million, which seems an incomprehensible number to the Victorians, is now a trivial matter. And we have, in fact, new modes of annotating and excerpting text for purposes of making dictionaries. This is, I pull this down from the Corpus of Contemporary American English. It's one of 2 corpora at Brigham Young that are probably the best annotated. Annotated means that parts of speech are marked, and you can query them in rigorous ways that you can't do with an interface like Google. And this is just a page showing with guttering, that is to say the relevant word is centered in the page, a number of citations for the word annotation with the various words that precede and follow it, and indications of the various genres in which it appears. Not surprisingly, it's most frequent. I don't know if it's, is that legible from there? Not surprisingly, it's most frequent in academic writing. And the temporal frequency isn't that interesting here, but obviously with other words it'll be interesting. You'll see the words increasing in frequency. And of course now we can also learn lots more about words than they could learn at the time of the OED. We can look at a much bigger historical corpora and discover that words that the OED thought were entered the language in 1960 really entered the language in 1910. We can look at words becoming more frequent. A word like propaganda enters the language in the 17th century, but it really, nobody's using it until 1914. It suddenly shoots up in frequency, which is the interesting date for cultural historians, certainly the time at which it catches on. So we have these elaborate, highly structured tools for annotating large corpora of literary works for purposes of extracting word senses and creating the dictionary. Similar tools for other kinds of annotation tend to be more problematic. I didn't mean to put this there. There have been, since really the earliest days of WYSIWYG interfaces, what you see is what you get interfaces, various systems involving hypertext, using hypertext to enable people to construct rich annotations or bodies of notes. Note cards, David Levy and I were at PARC, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in the 80s when this was first created by Randy Trigg and Frank Halas and Tom Moran. And it was an incredibly robust system for annotating, for creating annotations or systems of notes. You had sizable windows. You could use images or text or various other things. You had typed links, which is to say you could not only link two things, but indicate the type of the link. This is the cause of that, or this is an illustration of that, and so on. You could derive an arborescent, a tree structure that you could see to see all your notes and how they fit in, and so on. It was an extraordinary system that in a much simpler form was released by Apple as HyperCard. And there have been a number of such systems since. It was not a system that I found it possible, really, to use efficiently. There were a few people there who could actually sit down. There was a guy named Per Halverson, who could actually sit and create the whole structure of a paper in this thing and just, so to speak, dump it into a file, and it was a paper. The problem I had with this, and with the numerous systems that have come along since for this kind of annotation. Here's a matrix in Wikipedia of all the different systems and what they allow and what they don't. Here's one. Here are two more. There are lots of these things. The trouble is that to do these, to use these systems, you have to know in advance what kinds of relations and properties you want to capture, rather than just jotting down lots of things in some flat structure, which is why our students find it easiest to use just either a text file or maybe a Google Notebook file, but nothing, a Word Notebook file, but nothing more elaborate than that. Because after all, that stuff you discover after the fact. I mean, it's sometimes occurred to me that writing is 10% inspiration, 10% perspiration, and 80% transitions. And that's something you only learn when you've looked at this stuff. It reminds me of the system, the material, physical system for note-taking designed by Vincent Placius in 1689. Anne Blair, in her recent book, discussed it, but also in an earlier paper is where I first learned of it. It's this. Anne could describe it better than I could, but it's an elaborate system of doors and holes and slots, and you cut pages out, and you carve them. You could move them around. It basically was as close as you could get to a hypertext system in a pre-electronic age. Two of these were built. One for Placius himself, and one that was given as a gift by someone to Leibniz. And I figure, well, Leibniz is probably the only person in the 17th century who could have taken advantage of the full possibilities of this system. And the feeling I have when I see these elaborate systems is that they always remind me why I'm not Leibniz. It's a depressing experience, although one should be accustomed to it by now. I think that's, and this is a final word, I think that's what was so nice about hearing about some of the systems for collaborative note-taking that we heard about this afternoon. They permit rich forms of collaboration, but with very flat structures and without requiring more annotation than is necessary. The minimum of a burden is put on the user so that structure can grow, so to speak, out of the use itself, rather than having to be imposed by the system. So that's what I have to say. And it was a great conference, wasn't it? It was a terrific conference.
Thank you. I think there's nothing left to say other than to thank you very much for your wonderful concluding remarks. As a literary scholar, I loved to think that you started with a question about the note as a genre question. You know, what is a note? And it's a protocol of reading and of using.